when the United States is reducing its forces from Europe, it's actually emboldening our adversaries. It's raising questions about America's commitment to Europe, and that's unhelpful. We have the resources to do more in Europe. There's an urgency to do so, and we should actually be increasing our force posture in Europe. The Ankara summit for me was a time when the Europeans were stepping up, and the United States was actually stepping back, which to me is disappointing and concerning. The overmatch of power that NATO has over Russia is truly overwhelming. The real question is, does the NATO community, the transatlantic community, have the mindset necessary to exercise that power that will effectively deter Russia from taking such a precarious and dangerous and provocative move? And if it does, will they have the mindset to respond with an appropriate punitive action that will ensure that Russia backs off and doesn't do it again? There I'm a little bit uncertain.
Hello and welcome to Independence Avenue Media. I'm Carlos Sharashenica. Today we are joined by Brzezinski, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Europe and NATO policy. Mr. Brzezinski, first of all, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here.
So, Baltic and Polish leaders are warning that Russia could launch a limited military or hybrid provocation against NATO. Vilnius says it has intelligence suggesting Moscow may be planning attacks on critical infrastructure in the Baltic states or Poland. So how do you assess these warnings?
I think we have to take it very seriously for two reasons. One, the Poles and the Baltics and our other allies have actually pretty good intelligence on Russia. And I would say the Poles and the Balts are among those who best understand Russian strategic culture and thinking. And then second, there's precedent. Russia's been conducting hybrid warfare against the West, against our European allies, for well over a decade. And over the last several years, it's been intensifying. And of course, we shouldn't forget, we've had cable cutting incidents in the Baltic Sea, conducted at the behest of the Russians and by the Russians. We've had the Russians cut cables in between Svalbard and mainland Norway. And then, of course, we've had assassinations by the Russians across Europe. We've had violence against Russian dissidents across Europe. We had a terrorist attack on a Polish rail line within the last year. And then, of course, last September, the Russians launched some 20 to 23 drones deep into Poland. So the Baltics and Poland are very justified in issuing this warning.
When will NATO consider attacks like the ones you just laid out to fall under Article 5?
Well, there's no clear quote-unquote line with that. But what I can say is that the alliance and United States, North America, and Europe have failed to respond adequately to this long litany of Russian hybrid attacks, actions short of war, against its territory and its peoples. And in fact, I would argue that drone attack on Poland was an act of war. I mean, these were military drones that were sent in a premeditated fashion deep into Poland. And the West hasn't responded to that action, other than waving a finger and saying this is dangerous and unjustified. There wasn't even economic sanctions taken in response to that. So, in a way, the Western community of democracies, the transatlantic community, has actually encouraged Russia to escalate because they don't adequately respond to these acts of aggression.
And why have not we seen a stronger response from NATO?
Well, within the alliance, it's always tough to get consensus, and then I think among most nations in the alliance, there's a feeling that it's not worth escalating the conflict, and that's why they've been generally passive in response to these aggressions, and it's been a mistake, and it actually increases the risk of the Russians doing something even more precarious, more dangerous, more provocative, which of course increases the risk of a wider war, which is what we're all trying to prevent.
What do you see as the most immediate threat Russia poses to Europe today?
most immediate threat it's posing is not even a threat, it's an action. It's unjustified, unprovoked, and brutal aggression against Ukraine, which is an attempt to suborn an independent democratic state that has been a de facto NATO ally in terms of sending its troops in support of of allied operations. Um, that action is a threat to Ukraine. It's a threat to the principle of sovereignty, and it's a threat to the credibility of the NATO alliance. So that's the issue of the day that we should be focusing on and stepping up our actions to help support the Ukrainians defeat this invasion and end the war on its terms.
I mean, of course, the war in Ukraine is ongoing, but like beyond Ukraine, you mentioned the hybrid operations Russia has carried out over the years. So, what threats do you see to the Baltic states and to Poland specifically? Like, what are your expectations there?
Well, I'm worried that as the situation for Russia becomes worse in Ukraine, it will attempt to change that situation by escalating horizontally, by doing something provocative, kinetic against a NATO ally that it feels is most vulnerable and who would have the greatest difficulty in generating a unified and robust response from the alliance. And no particular scenario stands out as most immediate or most urgent, but everyone has to keep their eyes on, the Baltic states and the Arctic. I think those are the two areas of greatest concern for me.
Let me ask you about the U.S. military presence in Europe, like behind the headlines. What does that presence look like today? Like, what is Washington planning to change? And how do you see this process unfolding?
Well, today we have somewhere with roughly 70 to 80,000 troops, U.S. military personnel deployed and stationed in Europe. Of that, about 60,000 are permanently stationed in Europe, and that they have their military bases there. The personnel live there year round. They're not rotated in and out of Europe. That is, less than a third of what we had during the height of the Cold War, which is roughly 300 plus thousand troops. That's 300 plus thousand troops and personnel in Europe defending transatlantic interests. Today, the Trump administration, has signaled that it wants to further reduce America's military presence in Europe. I think it's a mistake. It rests on a false assumption that these elements of our force structure are an excessive burden on the United States military and becomes an intimidating, a limiting, a weakening factor in our ability to respond to crises elsewhere in the world. But I would point out that those 60,000 troops, 62,000 troops that are permanently stationed in Europe constitute less than 6%, probably less than 5% of the United States overall force structure. That is, force structure of professional full-time military personnel, which is about 1.3 million. And I'm not even taking into account our reserve forces and National Guard, which jack that number up to 2 million. Of the 30 F-35 squadrons that we have, only 2 are permanently stationed in Europe. Of our F-16 squadrons, which we have roughly 28, 27, 28, 29, depending on how you count, only 4 are permanently stationed in Europe. And when you think of kind of high-value, low-density items like Patriot air defense systems, of the 15 batteries the United States has, which will soon become 18 batteries, only 1 is permanently stationed in Europe. So our force structure is pretty slim and barely a burden on our ability to respond elsewhere in the world. And I would argue, in light of the significance of the transatlantic security relationship, the interest the United States has, the vital interest the United States have in Europe, we ought to be increasing our force posture as the Europeans increase their defense capabilities going forward. But I have to admit that is a minority position in the United States.
So, what happens if American forces leave before Europe is ready to replace them? And after the NATO summit, do you see any coordination between Washington and Europe on timeline?
Well, the Europeans are trying to coordinate, some sort of timeline with the Trump administration and its plans. The Ankara summit for me was a time when the Europeans were stepping up and the United States was actually stepping back, which to me is disappointing and concerning. The Europeans demonstrate they're stepping up by, demonstrating at the summit their commitment and their progress in living up to the Hague summit commitments, that is to increase defense spending as a total to 5% of GDP. And a lot of countries in NATO are making significant progress in that regard. The United States, unfortunately, brought to the alliance, a dark cloud that overhung the summit meeting that included, plans to do a force posture review, a national defense strategy that signaled an intent to further reduce our forces. And I would say, when the United States is reducing its forces from Europe, it's actually emboldening our adversaries. It's raising questions about America's commitment to Europe. And that's unhelpful. We have the resources to do more in Europe. There's an urgency to do so, and we should actually be increasing our force posture in Europe.
So after the Ankara summit, do you have any reason to be more optimistic about transatlantic relations?
Well, the summit had some positive dimensions to it. It demonstrated that the Europeans are fully committed to supporting Ukraine. They committed $70 billion for this year in security assistance support to Kiev. They promised to do another $70 billion of security assistance next year in 2027. In some ways, it was a scorecard summit in that the allies, the European allies, even the Canadians, made very clear and provided evidence of their commitment to, increase their defense spending to 5% and the progress they're making. They rolled out over $50 billion in defense contracts to build up that force capability. And so that was very, very, very positive. But, while there wasn't any political explosions at Ankara, I think it reinforced a kind of a trepidation among Europeans that the United States, under Trump, gradually withdrawing from Europe.
You mentioned that situation for Russia is getting worse in Ukraine. At the same time, Ukrainian strikes are reaching deep inside Russia. So what does that mean for Russia's ability to test NATO? How does it fit into this picture?
Well, the good news of Ukrainian success is that it reduces Russia's ability to really stand up against NATO or to, confidently exercise aggression against NATO. But as, Ukraine succeeds more and more on the battlefield, it's going to probably increase the likelihood that Putin will panic. And one way he may try to reverse the course of the war would be, as we discussed, horizontal escalation by perhaps executing some sort of aggression against NATO or a NATO member state. The idea being it would try and create divisions within the alliance that would break down support for Ukraine.
So, Mr. Brzezinski, in a few weeks, it will be 18 years since Russia's war against Georgia. Looking back, did the West miss the warning about what was coming next?
Well, 2008 should have been, or was, a shot across the bow that the transatlantic community should have recognized and taken action on. And instead, after Russia was pushed out of most, but not all, of Georgia, we immediately went back to normal relations with Russia for reasons that are beyond me. But that further emboldened Putin. And clearly, as we see today, he hasn't given up on his ambitions to suborn Georgia. And it certainly gave him confidence that he could act against Ukraine without a decisive transatlantic response. So that was the consequences of what happened in 2008 against Georgia.
We've been talking about the possibility that Russia could test NATO, But what about countries outside the alliance, like especially countries like Georgia, Armenia? So, what risks do they face from Russia?
Well, the risk is that Putin panicking because of the situation in Ukraine turning against him is to lash out horizontally. And while I have a tendency to focus on the Arctic and on the Baltics as potential contingencies, we shouldn't forget about the leverage that he has over the countries of the Caucasus, and he is still clearly smarting over his loss of Armenia, who's turned against, not turned against, but has decided to shift the focus of its relationships with the West.
How do you see the future of NATO enlargement? Is that like realistic in the near future?
Well, it depends how you define near future. Clearly, within the next 2 years, when President Trump is in office in Washington, it's very unlikely there'll be another round of extending membership to those countries who apply for NATO membership, like Ukraine, or for that matter, others in like a Moldova or perhaps in the Western Balkans. But the vision of a Europe that's whole and free, undivided, complete, to use terms, won't be fulfilled until Ukraine is a full member, and I would argue even Georgia is a full member. But that won't happen, I think, as long as President Trump is in office. Hopefully, the next American president will have a sounder strategic vision and will reanimate America's commitment to the vision of a Europe undivided, whole and free. And people, may say that sounds far-fetched today, but I remember in the not too distant past, at the Vilnius NATO summit, I forget when that was, I think it was 2023, there was near consensus within the alliance on initiating a serious process to bring Ukraine into the NATO alliance. And there are only two countries that were really blocking that. That was the United States under President Biden and Germany. And I would have argued if President Biden had decided to support that Ukrainian ambition, the Germans would have swung behind. So there is ample precedent to be confident that in the long run, the vision of a Europe whole and free will include a NATO that includes countries like Ukraine.
And this is my very last question. So to bring us back to where we started. So is NATO actually like ready for the scenario Baltic and Polish leaders are warning about?
Do we have the kit necessary to respond robustly? Do we have the kit necessary to deter such an event? Absolutely. There is massive alliance overmatch against Russian power. Think of just the economic weight. We're talking about some $60 trillion in combined GDP against roughly less than $2 trillion of Russian GDP. We're talking about, $1.5 trillion in defense spending versus $200 billion or less defense spending in Russia. We're talking about an alliance that has an extensive, set of relationships beyond the North Atlantic area, involving partners in the Indo-Pacific, the Middle East, and elsewhere. So the overmatch of power that NATO has over Russia is truly overwhelming. The real question is, does the NATO community, the transatlantic community, have the mindset necessary to exercise that power that will effectively deter Russia from taking such a precarious and dangerous and provocative move? And if it does, will they have the mindset to respond with an appropriate punitive action that will ensure that Russia backs off and doesn't do it again? There I'm a little bit uncertain.
Well, thank you so much again for your time, Mr. Brzezinski.
My pleasure, and it's great to see IMA taking off.
Thank you.